Can see you.
Excellent. Perfect. Thank you. You can hear me all okay. Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Adam. Good evening, everybody. Yep, my name is Stuart Walker. I'm a chartered financial planner. I work for a company called Johnston Carmichael Wealth. I am predominantly based in Aberdeen. We do have offices throughout other parts of Scotland, which I'll touch on later on. But yeah, I'm predominantly based in the northeast and in the Aberdeen area. When Kevin sent me the title, I didn't pick the title for this event, and when he sent it, I was slightly panicky that whilst I'd love to think that pensions and investments could save the world, I'll be honest, there's no pressure on that. And to be honest, pensions have never been that exciting, if I'm to be brutally honest about it. Pensions could never be described as an exciting investment or as an exciting topic. But what I will say is there is no doubt about it that they can play a big part, and that pensions themselves might not specifically play a big part, but certainly those investments that sit inside pensions, more of which we'll touch on later on, there's no doubt about it that they can play a very, very big part in being a positive, and certainly undoubtedly can be a force for good. So what I'm going to do is you're going to get about 10 minutes from me, from no other reason than, and David Appleton hates me saying this, but I'll say it anyway, is that his part's going to be far more interesting than mine. I could quite happily prattle on for hours about pensions, but I'll be brutally honest with you, I'm not entirely sure you'd want to listen to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of background just about pensions, where they have been and where we find ourselves in terms of what they look like, in terms of the range of investment options that are out there. I'll have one or two things at the end of maybe things you want to think about, some questions you want to ask people in terms of any advice that you are getting, or I know Adam's touched on it with regards to the USS and in particular the control he has over the investment decisions. So these are some questions that I would advise that you ask and at least consider with regards to your own pensions and investments. Just to give you a bit of background, so you're going to hear from David from Brooks Macdonald, and Brooks Macdonald are one of our investment partners. So they are one of the companies that we advise that our clients invest with, and he's going to touch more on the actual inside of the pension. I'm going to talk about, as I say, where a pension can be a force for good, but he'll touch a little bit more on specifics of the actual investment elements that sit inside pensions. So, okay, so I'll give you a little tip. I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds about who we are. We have 11 offices throughout Scotland. As you can see on that excellent map, we are predominantly northeast based. And certainly our biggest office, which is in Aberdeen, the office that I work out of. And we do have a number of different offices throughout the northeast of Scotland. And we have over 60 of us, the 60 of our staff in the specific Johnston Carmichael Wealth team. And we are part of a wider business. So we are part of the wider Johnston Carmichael Chartered Accountants business line. And you can see there are 300 years of experience. Some of us have, unfortunately, considerably more years rather than necessarily experience, but we do have a significant amount of experience and also access to a significant amount of money of assets under advice. So pensions, I mean, what I guess they mean very different things to each individual person, and I'm going to do just a little bit of a history lesson on pensions without, as I say, going into too much information, because I'm conscious that whilst I might get slightly excited about pensions, I know that not necessarily everybody else is. So pensions historically, and I'm going back kind of into the deepest, darkest past, if you wore some sort of business attire or a suit or a tie or whatever, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there's a reasonable chance that you were a member of what is called a final salary pension scheme. Now, final salary pensions were incredibly advantageous to employees, but not necessarily advantageous to employers because they're extremely expensive and therefore they cost an awful lot of money for employers to fund. But the biggest hindrance around final salaries was the decision-making process that people had with regards to investment options. So if you were a member of a final salary pension, you didn't really have a lot of choice about where your money went. Your money just got invested somewhere. It tended to be at the decisions of pension scheme trustees, none of which people seem to get much access to. So you as a member of that pension scheme, whilst it was probably quite lucrative to you, you didn't have much control. And you certainly couldn't control where the investment decisions were. Things have changed and things have moved on, but historically, that's how it was. You didn't have a lot of control over where your money went. Then latterly, I say latterly in the last 20 or so years, there's been a huge increase in what we call now personal pensions or employee-based workplace pension schemes, such as you'll have heard the phrases if you are from your employers of auto-enrollment, whereby an employer has a legal obligation to make a contribution to a pension on your behalf. And aside from that, another huge change has been the control that you have over those investment decisions and where your actual pension fund and where that money that sits in your pension goes. Where is it invested? You have a far greater range of investment options and you have a far greater range of control over the decisions as to where your money goes. Adam touched on it right at the beginning when he mentioned with the USA, he's been sitting in, I think it's a sustainable fund or certainly of some type of ethical fund that he's been investing in. He's been able to make that decision. He's got that control. And that's been the biggest change over the last, I would say 10, 15, 20 years, that people have been able to influence and control those investment decisions as to where their money goes. And to put some context on it, in the UK in the tax year 1920, £31.3 billion was put into personal pensions, which is an enormous sum of money in anyone's world. But to be able, if people then have control over that money, to be able to make the right investment decisions in terms of sustainable, ethical, whatever you want to call it, if you're able to make those investment decisions with your own money, it can only, there's no doubt about it that can undoubtedly be a force for good. Also, the average pension fund for most people, the average in the UK is just under £62,000. Now, in most people's lives and in most people's, compared to their other investments other people hold, the likelihood is that that will be the single biggest pot of money that they have. In most people's cases, their pension tends to be the single biggest pot of money. So if we put that together with the range of investment options that you have and the increased number of investment decisions and options that you have as an individual with that fund, there is no doubt about it that pensions can undoubtedly be a positive and be a force for good. So to give you a bit of David's going to touch on some of these phrases and you'll hear a little bit more about these later on, but I wanted to give just a bit of a history lesson and a kind of where we were and where we're kind of moving towards. And there's no doubt that we're not the finished article in the financial planning world when it comes to making, dare I say, the right decisions around climate change, around the right ethical decisions. We aren't there. There's a lot of work still to be done. I think it's been a huge, huge step forward, but there is definitely a lot of work to be done. Historically, back kind of probably mid-80s, kind of moving into the 90s, then there was the start of what was called ethical funds. Now, ethical funds tend to suffer or did suffer slightly from, dare I say, a bit of a, and the phrase there, negative screening, they suffered from a bit of a negative reputation, which isn't necessary. In some cases it was valid, there's no doubt about it, but in a lot of other cases it wasn't necessarily valid. And the phrase negative screening meant effectively the funds were created by excluding certain activities, whatever those activities were, and they tended to be oil and gas or tobacco or even or alcohol, or there was a whole host of different options, but people tended to exclude certain activities or exclude certain environmental criteria. And there became a perception that, well, if you have a limited range of investment options, then that will limit the performance that your fund will get. So there's no doubt that it suffered a little bit from people's perception that I want to go down an ethical fund route, until they looked at the performance of the funds and realized that in some cases it was poorer than other fund performance, and people tended to back away from it. So that isn't necessarily right, but as a perception, historically, they'd suffered from this negative perception of what ethical funds might actually be. The very positive and huge step forward has been into what's now called positive screening. So actually, I want to create an investment fund or a portfolio to invest my money in, of companies that do this, that do that, that do these things. So effectively, they are positive. You're looking to invest in a company that does something positive rather than excluding a negative thing. So whether it's just the name, the phrase, or the change, but certainly there's been a huge increase and a huge step forward because of positive screening. So away from this negative and much more towards how can we do good, and what might that good look like. And then the big probably explosion and huge growth area has been around what you'll hear the phrase ESG. So environmental and social governance funds. And David's going to talk a little bit more on that. But we've seen a massive shift in what this kind of small niche perception world to a far greater and expansive range of investment options, of which can do an awful lot of good. So that, coupled with a huge amount of money that's available for pensions and the huge availability of an increased range of environmental and social governance funds, whilst the humble pension might not save the world, it's certainly, there is a potential that it can do, that the funds that sit inside that can do an awful lot of good. So that said, I do think, and I have to be careful how I phrase this, that I do think that the financial planning community, of which I am part of, we still have an awful lot of work to do. I think there is a huge amount of, I think we hold the key. We have a huge number of clients as the overall UK financial planning community, and in the northeast of Scotland financial planning community, but we have to ask better questions. We have to ask the right questions of our clients. So I think there is quite a bit of, we have an obligation to educate our clients and ensure that they're aware of what's out there. And that, I think, starts from questions. You'll see here, change the questions we ask. You might not be able to read that box. I realize it's quite small, but this is, I have lifted this from what was we call it our information gathering document. It's effectively what we call a fact find, where we ask a range of questions of clients and various different things to ascertain some kind of cold and hard facts. And this used to be the only question that we had about ethical investments, as it was called then. So, and the question, and I know it's dreadful is the honest answer, says here, do you have any strong ethical views on where your money should be invested? Any strong ethical views? Almost every client said no, because it's not the right questions. And we as an organization are undertaking a huge exercise to change the question, and we're going through that process right now, to change the questions that we ask. Because if you ask people the question of, do you wish your money to do good? If we had a range of investment options that were available that you could invest in, that would help the local community, or would help the northeast of Scotland, or would help Scotland Wild, or whatever that looks like, would you be interested in investing in those? Everybody will say yes. So we as a financial planning community have a responsibility to ensure that we ask the right questions, and that is an exercise that we as an organisation are going through. We were a little bit loath also at Johnston Carmichael Wealth to jump on a bandwagon here, until we felt really as a company that we sort of lived and breathed in a socially responsible way, because we didn't want to fully just launch an ESG proposition. And there is a lot of that going on out there, that people are launching these propositions, and then actually when you look a bit deeper, they're not truly adhering to the social responsibilities that they have. So we as an organization wanted to make sure that we live and breathe that before we just roll it out for the sake of it. So we do have ESG portfolios, but we're still at that early stage. And the biggest positive change for me is, though, it's becoming unacceptable not to invest any other way. And that, I think, is another huge shift in the financial planning community, and David will touch on it from an investment point of view as well. So if I can leave you with one thing, and I know that's a bit of a whirlwind of pensions, and I would encourage you that to look at your own pensions and look at your own investments and ask questions of whoever it is that necessarily manages it, or whether it's through your employer, and ask them what options are in there. What options do I have from an investment point of view? Because what people tend to do is when they, particularly for an employer point of view, they tend to go into what's called the default fund. So you start a new job, they give you all these forms that don't make any sense from a pension point of view. You tick a few boxes and you send it back to HR. And it tends to go into default funds, but there undoubtedly will be a far wider range of investment options that you have. So I would just encourage you to look at what those investment options are and to ask questions to those people, because they certainly will be out there, and that ability to, as I say, enable your pension to do a lot of good and be a force for good is undoubtedly there. Right, thank you. That's me. I'll stop talking about pensions. Adam, I'm going to just unshare my screen and mute myself, and I'll hand back to you.
Okay, that's brilliant.